This is the fifth event in the series, The Digital Futures of, which opened last September with our inaugural lecture, AI, the means to an end or a means to the end. Our last event, The Digital Futures of Security, was online. Following tonight, our next event will be What Does Quantum Mean for Humanity, which is in collaboration with King's Culture and the Science Gallery, London, where an exhibition called Quantum Untangled has just opened. So I recommend that to you. We have a full series of events planned for this new academic year, including, coming up in December, the Digital Futures of Education, and then, following that, sessions on art, music, and health. The idea is that there is one of these every month, so please do keep a lookout for these. If you want to find out more about the Digital Futures Institute, you can join our mailing list and find out about other events in the series, or visit our website or follow us on social media. The word history has the same ambivalence as the word narrative, for which it's in some contexts a synonym, just as a narrative means both a story and the act of telling that story. So history is a name both for what happened in the past and for what its successors or survivors make of what happened. So history is more than just preservation or retrieval, it's also making intelligible. In a sense, nothing can be said to have happened at all unless or until it's happened twice, once in actuality, and then again in recall or recounting. So history is always caught up in a sort of future tense, in that it concerns not just what happened, but what will have happened. All disciplines worth their salt secretly believe they include everything, and they sometimes have pretty good warrant for this. But it's also true that very few disciplines can genuinely claim an absolute monopoly of specialization. As the teacher of the sort of texts that are known as literary texts myself, I've sometimes offered an alternative job description, professor of made-up things. But this is an area in which most humans already have extensive expertise. Very few of the questions that philosophers ask themselves have never occurred to anyone else. There might be one or two, perhaps. But of all the academic specialisms, the exercise of making sense of the past is maybe the one that spills most extravagantly beyond the domain of its official practice. This leakiness of previously watertight disciplinary vessels is one of the most telling effects of the information revolution, as a result of which, as the anthropologist Clifford Geertz was already able to observe as early as 1983, nobody is leaving anybody else alone and isn't going to, ever again. 40 years previously, Walter Benjamin, interpreting Paul Klee's painting Angelus Novus, which he in fact owned, described it as a picture of the angel of history with outspread wings being blown backwards into the future by a wind from paradise, irresistibly being projected forwards while having to face backwards, watching the debris piling up. I've invited our speakers tonight, all of them taken up in some way with the historical enterprise, to sit similarly with their backs to the engine, looking forward to the kind of retrospections that may become possible and even unavoidable in our future or futures. So we'll be hearing in this order from Stuart Dunn, Professor of Spatial Humanities in the Department of Digital Humanities at King's, from Vincent Hiribaran, Reader in Modern History in the Department of History in King's, and then finally from Stephen Whiteman, Professor of the Art and Architecture of China at the Courtauld Institute of Art. I'll sit down and simply call for them to take their place. Each of them is going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. If they go over that time, I will have a little lever which will deposit them in the Thames, and you'll see them bobbing up and down. But it's all right. They will be speaking for that period, and that will then give us time for questions and discussion at the end. So please welcome Stuart Dunn to begin.
So, thank you very much for that introduction, Steve. So, in 1937, H.G. Wells imagined an interconnected world information system of the future, which he termed the Permanent World Encyclopedia. This would have been a carefully curated and presented repository of the world's knowledge, which would supplement and eventually replace, as he saw it, the outmoded idea of the encyclopedia from the 18th and the 19th century, and also by the knowledge traded in by traditional universities, which did not, he said, perform the task nor exercise the authority that might reasonably be attributed to the thought and knowledge of the organization of the world. Never again would there ever have to be misinformation or false narratives or unevidenced claims, because an army of professional librarians and curators and archivists would have custody of the world's knowledge in what he called a well-ordered scheme of reference and reproduction. Fast forward to 2001, and the closest manifestation of the Permanent World Encyclopedia is, of course, Wikipedia. We might tip a gentle smile in H.G. Wells's direction as to how this encyclopedia operates and whether it is indeed truly global. But rather than a professional staff of curators and librarians, we have seen, rather, a set of models and processes for the management and presentation of information through volunteer effort evolve relatively successfully. In 2002, just 1 year after the launch of Wikipedia, it had something like 48,000 articles. Today's estimate for that is something like 65 million articles in 340 languages, so a global encyclopedia indeed. 2002 was also the year of my favorite Onion headline lamenting the fact that a factual error had been found on the internet. Now, looking back at the space of a quarter of a century, the fact that this was even seen as satire at the time is telling. So from the early days, it was acknowledged that there was the need for a stable repository of global information of the kind that H.G. Wells envisaged, but we weren't quite there yet. So as a response to this, as noted in the description of this event, was a push in the 1990s and early 2000s to digitize the content which humanities scholars relied upon. Now, in those heady days before the 2008 financial crash, this meant considerable investment from bodies like the AHRC, who, according to this list of projects, put several millions, £7 or £8 million, just from this tranche of the AHRC's resource enhancement scheme alone, which I am old enough to remember. Now, inevitably, however, efforts to plan and fund efforts to digitize humanities knowledge replicated existing structures and existing content. Even at the time, however, it became clear that the efforts and ambitions to digitize this content would push both its form and its use into completely new and potentially unexpected directions. In 2000, the eminent digital humanities scholar Susan Hockey was already noting that the future humanist researcher would be as interested in complexity and the type of digital objects that comprise their subject of study as the content itself. And she said there, much remained to be done to work towards a common methodology to allow different and complex types of material that are the subject of humanities research to be explored. Now, posterity has shown that one such kind of humanities information object, which probably could not have been anticipated at the time, was the digital vernacular expression, for example, the social media post. Now, the mid-noughties, which is a horrible phrase, but I can't think of a better one, was a time of great change in the online world. Facebook was launched in 2004, Twitter, X, as was in 2006. The word crowdsourcing was coined by the tech journalist Jeff Howe, also in 2006. This was a period when the World Wide Web was evolving from a publication platform to an interaction, a conversation platform, the world of so-called Web 2.0. Now, as Trevor J. Blank pointed out in the introduction to his landmark edited volume of 2009, Folklore and the Internet, while the fields of anthropology, cultural studies, sociology, communication studies, etc., began to engage with this burgeoning internet, folklore studies was largely left behind. Now, I should also say that emergence of the sort of the interdisciplinary collective is very much in evidence in the digital humanities department here at King's. Yeah. But folklore studies was largely left behind. Now, Blank's volume in 2009 was a landmark in this, but it's worth thinking a bit about why. Now, conventional definitions of key ideas such as superstition stress the informality and fuzzy nature of both the information it relies upon and the evidence for it. So this definition from the 1989 Dictionary of Superstitions is a case in point. Blank, however, stressed the community, the communal, and the sort of contemporary significance of folklore beyond the archives, stating that folklore should be considered to be the outward expression of creativity in myriad forms and interactions by individuals and their communities. Now, in the context of this definition, Blank goes on to argue that the printing and distribution of printed material promoted the study of folklore in the 19th and 20th centuries, but that the internet was effectively the new print. Now, Blank and others acknowledge the physical metaphors of the online space, which is itself a metaphor, web page, surfing, portable document, etc., and states that the internet has an inherent base in the real world, that there is a human behind everything that happens online. So this, I think, is the key statement that we need to consider. So the cultural theorist Guro Flinterud recently argued that the algorithm, which sorts content on platforms such as X, shape the behavior of those contributing content and exerting a priori influence on which pieces of information they do and do not see. She calls the algorithm a traditional type of folklore connector, but in the digital world. So to the digitized archive, therefore, we must add the decidedly non-human and immaterial actor of the algorithms. Now, does truth even matter these days? When confronted in a 2023 interview about alleged historical inaccuracies in his movie Napoleon, Ridley Scott said, when I have issues with historians, I ask them, were you there, mate? Well, then, shut me up. And in 2002, we have various high-reach individuals pushing potentially dubious historical statements online. Does it matter if they're dubious? Well, even before he bought Twitter, Musk had enormous reach, which drove the algorithms which sought the information. And in 2022, Graham Hancock's Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse developed the theory, or explored the theory, that there was a kind of interconnected civilizational spread across the world pre-Ice Age, for which there was no evidence and which archaeologists were apparently covering up for some reason, which, despite, possibly tenuous nature of these claims, one basis of this was that the fact that pyramids apparently appeared in Southeast Asia, Egypt, and South America in the same time frame. Well, if you put a small stone on top of a large stone and they're reasonably flat, they'll probably stay in place. If you put a large stone on a small stone, it'll probably fall off. That's basically the science of pyramids, and you Probably don't need to be connected to other civilizations to know that. Also, I would just add, anyone who thinks that there is a global conspiracy of silence of archaeologists should try line managing them. It's not happened. But this was nonetheless framed as a legitimate debate, whatever its framing. And again, the reach of Ancient Apocalypse was quite extraordinary, 25 million viewing hours. And yes, this created protests from professional organizations like the Society of American Archaeologists, which simply fueled, the supposed framing of this debate. Now, the phenomenological mediation of the screen makes it very hard to tell these different kinds of connector apart. So in a recent post, the historian of belief, Francis Young, makes this intriguing argument that large language models and AI and the content they generate are perceived as literally true. The example he gives is that, AI can parse the 107 surviving books of Livy, the Roman historian, and then literally produce his missing works. There is no perceived difference between the reality and the generated content. We talk of generative AI, not creative AI. So this is the context of my question. Can AI literally be superstitious? This is meant to be more of a provocation than a literal question. And what I want to provoke us to consider is a comparison between AI-generated content, the logic of the algorithm driven by theoretically limitless computational power over billions of training data sets across the web, with the complete absence of logic inherent in superstition. Is there really a meaningful difference between the two of them? This, I think, is not a reflection on what the future of folklorists will do, but the kind of problem that they will have to solve. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you. You like that.
Thank you, Stuart. Let me try. So today I'm going to do a small experiment. My name is Vincent Herban. I work in the history department, and I constantly read archives that we call primary sources. And I'm going to try to use archives, to read archives with AI, basically. That's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to show you a document which I've used previously in my previous research on the history of Cameroon. And I'm going to compare the results of my previous research with the research I undertook for the last 3-4 months with AI, basically. Okay, that's the plan for the next 10 minutes. So, what do academic papers say about AI when they talk about history? They basically just say rubbish. It doesn't work. Just AI is by historian, right? So you got a whole literature based on that. My point is that in 2025, actually, AI has made tremendous progress, and now you can do a few things with AI, actually. Historians can use it somehow. But let me show you how. But in the end, you see AI doesn't do history very well. It's not a good historian. But let's see. Let's have a look. What's the case study I just mentioned? I was a member of a commission of historians who had a look at the history of the Cameroonian War of Independence up until last year, right? It's very fresh. We published a book in January. It's a massive book with 7 historians from Cameroon and 7 historians from France. As you can hear, I'm French. I specifically worked on the history of the British-controlled UN territory of Cameroon, because I'm based here in London, and basically had a look at, what is modern-day Anglophone Cameroon. That was my role in that. So while I didn't use AI tools in my previous research, I basically had to look at the same documents over again to see what was happening. I even checked one set of documents on purpose on one massacre, which happened on the 8th of August 1961. I just chose deliberately one set of archives. Why? Because actually it was more easy to use with AI. You just upload one PDF and you see what happens here. So that's just the whole experiment for today. Let's have a look at the results, basically. That's why I tried to do it here today. I chose a context which was very easy to control somehow, and I tried to control the parameters of my whole experiment. So basically, really, I tried to minimize the risks of hallucinations, to minimize the risks of misinterpretations, to minimize all the risks I all heard about when you hear about AI. I used Gemini 2.5 Pro with an API. Why? Because I didn't want to upload all these files online, because Google, in theory, doesn't sell my data, doesn't reuse it. It can't be, but that's the theory. I tried as well to do that in ethical way, even if obviously it can be quite hard to do. The idea as well was to criticize my own practices as a historian and as a lecturer as well when I analyze primary sources. So basically what happened? I told you I wanted to analyze one event, which happened on the 8th of August 1961. And basically what happened was the Cameroonian army, called the Cameroon Republic Security Forces, killed 12 individuals then. And what the archives told me that, yes, it was actually this Cameroon army. They were led by a French officer, because actually France has still a massive presence in Cameroon. And basically, all this happened when Britain was supposed to hand over the territory of British-controlled Cameroons to the newly independent Republic of Cameroon. That's the whole context here. That's the prompt I created after a few trials and errors. That's the prompt I created. I created 4 sets of questions. So now I'm going to go through the 4 questions, okay? I can go back to it a bit later. So can you present a summary of the documents? Remember these documents? And here, to tell you the whole story, it took me 3 to 4 days to read the whole batch of documents as a human being. It took less than 5 minutes for AI to read the whole set of documents. It was much faster and much better than what I could do. It could even answer questions about the nature of documents. It could do something that I ask all my students to do in class, and I see one of them today, former students here, just to analyze them very quickly. Tell me what this is about, where it happened, who is where, and that's amazing here. So basically, well, that's going well. I'm saving time here. Now, I ask the question, who was responsible for the killings? And here somehow, I saw something quite interesting. I told you that everyone knew it was the Cameroon army with a French officer. And the documents straight away told me, yes, it was the Cameroon army. And even repeated the same language already available in the documents. So somehow here I kind of suspected there was a form of confirmation bias, right? I've been writing, this is about, these are the Cameroon soldiers led by a French officer, and right, this is what happening here. And the same language was repeated in the answer. The answer was accurate, but actually maybe repeated something which was already in documents here. So here, basically, I can use that information, right? That's something usable. It's fast and easy. Now let's have a look at the things which didn't work. And that's, I guess, the most interesting things for us here. That slide in particular is very interesting. What do these documents bring to our current understandings of the Tombell incident? That's the name of the murders here. What happened here is that every time I asked a question in different ways, is that I had a vague answer, okay? It was very vague. Why was it vague? Because actually all the literature available on the history of Cameroon is either available in other British, French, or Cameroon archives, or available in Cameroon universities, and here we're not talking about things which are not digitized, right? Or behind a paywall. And basically, Gemini could not definitely at all, answer that question. That's the first case here. So basically what's happening here is that it's a Black History Month, right? It's important to mention it here. When we talk about the history of Africa, there's a real problem of dissemination of knowledge, and here we can still see it with that answer. Second thing, I played with the parameter of AI, which is quite interesting to play with. It's called temperature, right? The more you raise the temperature, the more speculative AI answers become. It's quite interesting. So if the temperature is 0, it's going to be very factual. If it's 2.0, it's to 2.0, it's going to become very speculative. And the experience was very interesting because if I raise the temperature to 2.0, what I had was, the cardinal sin of what historians can do was hindsight. Basically, here AI, because it was trained on very recent material, actually saw the premise of what's happening currently in Cameroon. And there's an ongoing crisis in Cameroon going on now, in this 1961 incident. So basically, I had a very well-crafted document telling me that everything which happened then actually led to the current crisis. And that's, of course, historians use the present to somehow ask questions to the past. And, as a historian, I know that. I'm influenced by that somehow. But, as the saying goes, the past is a foreign country. We'll need to be careful with that. And clearly here, there's something which happened with hindsight. And if I raise the temperature, basically that's what I saw, okay? One thing which was quite interesting as well, which I didn't write here, is that somehow AI started reproducing, the LLM started reproducing a language used by anti-colonial leaders, somehow because there's lots of material online available about the fight against the Europeans, he had a very kind of, the words being used were used, which could have been used by activists in the 1960s and 70s. So somehow it was quite interesting to see how Gemini 0.5 became an anti-colonial leader when I raised the temperature. I can't, prove it really, but that was quite interesting. I told you, basically, that I've got a problem with the results I got, because actually I went, too far into the past. So I thought I should ask a question about what happened here in England in the last 10 years. Some of you might have heard about the migrated archives, maybe. The archives which were hidden by the British when they decolonized many of the territories and the former colonial empire, which became public in the 2010s when they were used in a trial against the British Crown. And basically, people could prove they were tortured by the British in Kenya, could receive compensation by the British state. Okay, this led to massive scandal, and many archives were released. Okay, including the ones I'm using today. So I thought I should ask a question. Since you don't know enough about the past, the 1960s, can you tell us much more about what happened in the last 10 years? To what extent is that set of documents different from, the others? And basically what it did is that it repeated the same kind of arguments which you can find in other newspaper articles, which you could find in any other case, such as the Kenyan one I just mentioned. So basically here, maybe I didn't ask the question in the right way, but I had a kind of tautological answer. So I asked a question which was already, was already the answer in itself somehow, which is quite interesting when you think about it. Maybe some of you have tried it. You can even see the reasoning of AI at the moment. You can ask, please show me how you reached that conclusion. So that's what I've done. Please show me. And basically, it's AI set parameters. So Gemini 0.5 set parameters, which basically repeated my question in a circular way. And basically, my answer could only be answered. My question, could only be answered in a very positive way. So, all this to say that I had a look at a coherent batch of documents. That's the reference number here. I've never obtained such a level of detail at that speed. Clearly, it's much faster than what I've done. And even AI was able to decipher handwritten documents in a way which I've never seen before. So clearly here, there's something going on here. And that's something new in 2025, clearly, I can say. But there's a massive confirmation bias in some answers. It's very vague sometimes, but it's written in a very affirmative tone. It's like it's very convinced of its own answer. There's some hindsight visible in some questions about the larger context. And sometimes some answers tend to be tautological. I think I will stop here, but to show the potential and the pitfalls of using AI with primary sources. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. These are tough acts to follow. I am speaking tonight from the perspective of art history, I guess we have three different disciplines tonight, and thinking both about the digital and perhaps about AI. I am not a person who works very much with AI, actually really at all, but have thought some about its role, particularly its potential role in art history. And seeing my co-panelists' titles, which both advertised some comment on AI, I felt pressured into putting it into my talk. But we'll see. I will also try to speak about a couple of other things as well. I'm just going to start a timer because my internal clock is not as good as theirs. Digital methods in art history have somewhat, like many things in art history, have somewhat followed on their application, development and application in other disciplines. And as you would imagine in digital humanities generally, digital methods in art history take a whole variety of forms. Network analysis, corpus analysis, especially spatial analysis, which has been where most of my work has been done. And then in recent years, more and more on computer vision, which is ultimately a form of machine learning, which may be a better term than AI for much of what we're trying to talk about tonight. And there has been, I would say overall, mixed success in art history with digital methods, partially due to the types of questions that we're asking, the types of work that we're doing, and also, I think, partially due to its expense, its work intensiveness, and a question of whether it is changing our perspectives on art and its history or the social history of art in quite the ways that that other major methodological and theoretical innovations have. Art history is probably, in some respects, particularly interested in the types of challenges and questions that the digital raises, because the digital itself is a form of media or mediation. And art history is a field that is both, in terms of its subject matter, but also in a sort of meta-methodological sense, deeply engaged with media. I'm going to drop it now. We, of course, while we speak about art, which of course is some form of media, as a colleague of mine once quipped in an article, art history in many respects remains the history of that which can be photographed. And without getting into that question, the point really is to say that while we try to take our students to look at real objects, to speak in front of real objects, to look closely at them, particularly at the undergraduate level, what we study is not painting, but the remediation of painting, right? The photography of painting and various things like this. As such, we are very interested in questions of images and their status. And trying to sort of critically understand and unpack the trail back to the original object and how that object has changed over time and over mediation. We are also, I think, quite interested, therefore, in publishing and the way in which, or dissemination, the way in which what we say and what we're trying to present gets presented. And this is not intended as a slight on any other discipline or its rigor in this particular regard, but ask an art historian what they think of their most recent book, and you'll often have them complaining about the image quality. Oh, the images are rubbish. Well, ask a historian the same question, they'll often produce images that are perfectly adequate for their purposes, but an art historian might see as largely illegible. I say that, again, not as a criticism, but because I think that the digital has offered a whole variety of, the broadly digital, not to say the computational, has offered a whole variety of opportunities around presentation of arguments, about thinking past the codex, about thinking about the affordances of web publication and moving images and the embedding of different types of media and publication that have extended the ways in which some art historians are seeking to make and think through their arguments. And particularly, as I'll talk about a little later, the relationship between the media of our argument and the media of our study, the relationship between how I make my argument and the thing it is that I'm actually working on. AI itself has relatively limited use so far in, there it is, a relatively limited use so far in much of art history. But I would cite particularly a conference I was just at on Chinese painting and its materials. I would go to such a thing, that was particularly interesting from a conservation and a materials analysis point of view. We are able to use various photographic technologies to produce a level of data that, as one of the speakers that day pointed out, essentially demands faster processing and demands the type of opportunities that AI or machine learning can offer us for producing that data. In the history of art, however, AI, broadly speaking, presents a whole series of problems that are connected broadly with the problems associated with very large or largely uncurated data sets. It is not a surprise to anybody that the internet is not only frequently wrong, but it's also frequently deeply biased, offensive, racist, sexist, all sorts of things. And that comes out in some ways that are particularly subtle and difficult to unpack through images. We can perceive bias in text, I think, in more readily in many regards than we necessarily perceive it in images. And that is because, I think, the way in which we naturalize the reading of images. We see them and we process them and we think we understand what they're saying to us, even when, in fact, there may be more going on. For instance, Google Art and Culture, which is not in and of itself, at least in its origin, AI or machine learning, is a really good example of this. It became the data source for early AI image making, and people wound up and said, oh, these images are awfully white. They're awfully European. They're awfully sexist. Yes, that's because that's the database that Google was providing. And again, I do say that not so much, well, I do say that as a criticism, not because it was Google's intent, but because implicit in the building of a lot of the data sets in art history that we would have are histories of institutions, histories of collecting, often of which are built on histories of colonialism. So the data sets are problematic in precisely the ways that art history as an analog, let's say, or a conventional practice are seeking to unpack. History of art is also, it's probably fair to say, somewhat skeptical of macro questions, the types of questions that historians might seek to address through very large data sets. History of art remains a, relatively speaking, micro-history field, and therefore I think we also worry about what this type of stuff might do. Finally, we might think about some of the things that AI now, or computer vision now, is often used to explore some of the work that is going on, particularly in computer science departments. And here again, I intend to be both polite, but also critical. One of the great promises in particularly the public imagination, but also a sort of great deal of academic imagination of AI and of computer vision with relation to the history of art is around connoisseurship. The idea that a computer will be able to tell us whether that Vermeer is real or not in a way that humans cannot. The first issue is it is true here in a Rubens, in which this AI this AI analysis of painting has attributed to Peter Paul Rubens, concluded with 91% certainty that it was not by the artist. I'm a Chinese art historian. I have not studied Western art history past undergraduate. I can tell you with 100% certainty that that is not by Rubens. That the first issue is it's not doing a great deal that we can't already do fairly readily with our own eyes if we're trained in it. The second thing is to say that art history, it has moved substantially past, or sought to move substantially past, this type of positivistic connoisseurship as a problem, because it is understood as being fraught with bias of all varieties. And I say that because AI now, and much of what sort of computer science is bringing to art history, is sometimes uninformed by the debates about it within art history about what types of, how sight works as a bias process, and how computers might replicate some of that bias. So I would argue, therefore, or I would suggest, therefore, for a couple of different ideas about some of the places that I think art history and computers can go in productive manners. And I'm going to make I'm not the only person who's introduced a little bit of their own work, but I'll conclude with a couple of minutes about a current project, which is not intended to be put forth as exemplary, but rather at least as exemplifying what I'm thinking about as possibilities. And those two things are broadly the importance of working on, as both my colleagues have talked about, bespoke or constrained data sets. We can control what comes out by controlling and being very cognizant of what comes in. And being aware, tailoring our questions to the data set that we have, something that we would all do as historians all the time. And the other is thinking about how we can decenter digital humanities and decenter digital art history, which is to say, to think about the ways in which the sort of default position of the computer, of data science, is often essentially Eurocentric, and think about how we can adapt some of that work and some of the way we use computers to build models that are not in that way, that don't interpret the rest of the world through that particular lens. So in this case, I am currently working on a project called the Virtual Mountain Estate, which is part of a larger product called X Sheds or Experience Sheds. And what Experience Sheds or X Sheds is trying to do is develop thick models of subjective experience in the historic past, particularly of, in this case, early modern Chinese landscapes, because that's something that I work a great deal on, but also provide a model that might be applied in other respects. In the case of the virtual mountain estate, it draws very, very closely on a specific imperial text, which you see an example of here, that describes the subjective and experience of that landscape in a variety of texts and provides an image that supports it. We've used these sources, as well as other archival sources and study of the site itself, to build an ontological framework for experience within the Chinese context, to think past the CDOC model of a ontology of experience to a sort of extension of CDOC that specifically describes the nature of experience in pre-modern China as the sources seem to describe it, and we can seem to discuss it, to offer both researchers and viewers something that we think is rooted in those sources, but that is also experiential. The result, which I won't show more than just this, is a series of interactive and in some cases immersive models that attempt to allow someone to both read about in a sort of scholarly way, but also to experience some sense of what we understand the text and the site to be describing and to be offering, to engage directly with a different type of scholarly presentation on this front. And so what I want to conclude by saying is simply that we are seeking to, what I hope to suggest is of using the opportunities of emerging technologies to extend the way in which we think about both the past and the materials through which we know the past, or attempt to know it. As such, the digital is something, is in some sense not really new, but the latest in a long history of innovation, the book, the print, photography. It also requires the same types of critical gaze and self-reflexivity demanded by so-called analog, or what we might call analog sources and methods, and deserves particular caution, both for its power, what it can do, what it potentially can its reach through data sets, and particularly through the seductiveness of its claims, which I think are often particularly seductive in images. Well done, however, I think the digital also offers opportunities for new types of analysis, argument, and presentation of history. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all three of our speakers. So now the space is yours. We welcome our online audience and cherish them so much so that we really want them to be able to hear what's going on in the room. In common with almost any other academic room that you will find, this room has terrible acoustics, so we can't rely on nature alone. So we need technological assistance. So please wait until the microphone reaches you. Only it's that one, so I'm not quite sure.
Is that one?
Yes. Who is going to? It's going to be Fumi who's going to convey it to you.
Thank you. Cheers.
So here is your opportunity for questions, curiosity, polite denunciations, and the sort.
All right, can I start maybe? So one of the ideas of artificial intelligence is that you grow these enormous models, and that they somehow, the bigger they are, magically through some latent variables emerging from, they're going to give answers that you wouldn't expect, that would be interesting. So all three presentations seem to suggest the opposite, which is that you need to carefully craft your models to get anything meaningful. Is that correct?
Yes.
No. So, I mean, certainly, I think that from the perspective of images, I mean, I guess that I would say that it's no different than, from my perspective, than any other form of source criticism. You need to understand your data pool and your source pool, and you need to craft your questions to reflect that source pool. And the problem, at least with things like Google Art and Culture, is, or the internet, is the proposition that it somehow, which you're not suggesting, but is the proposition that's often been suggested, that it somehow uncritically gathers everything. But of course it doesn't. Google Art and Culture only captures the things, the portions of such collections as certain museums have chosen to provide. And so its source pool is actually both in a non-critical fashion biased, which is to say it's just not neutral, but also reflects the very biased histories of the sources of the institutions that it conducts. That's not to say that I don't think machine learning on images is possible. I just think you have to be very cognizant of what you're putting into it and therefore what you're asking of it.
To add up to that, actually, I created a module called Digital History. And I don't know if you understand, I trained as a historian of Africa. I noticed very quickly, because I was trained to notice patterns of oppression, exploitation, racism, sexism, all this kind of stuff, which is unfortunately part of what I teach. I could find as well in digital history. So yes, the answer is yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess all I would say in response to that question is that whatever you get back from an LLM or an AI model or whatever, I suppose one aspect is that part of the business model of AI is that it agrees with you, which is, which, you know, it's a sort of is a bit of a limitation for kind of any sort of critical interpretation. So I think we just need to develop sort of new forms of critical frameworks for dealing with the outputs, you know, no matter how big the models themselves get. I mean, we have to evolve our way of assessing the outputs along with those, as we have with other kinds of, potentially questionable information sources, you know, what goes into the sausage with other sorts of information sources.
Hi. Whoa, loud. I have a comment and a question. The comment is for Stuart. AI can't be superstitious because it knows very well that being superstitious brings bad luck. But the reason why I'm saying this is obviously AI is what we train it to be, right? But actually, my question is different. So AI is not just machine learning. There is a lot more to AI that has to do with machine learning, much like digital is not just AI. And so I was wondering, especially, you know, I take Stuart as an example, but the same question applies to the other two panelists. You showed Wikipedia and other forms of digital world which are not AI related. So in your studies, in your work, have you encountered things that are interesting today that are not necessarily machine learning?
I hope so. Shall I go first? Is that all right? I mean, I would say yes. I mean, I suppose one of the reasons I brought up Wikipedia is, you know, looking back on a historical perspective of 25 years, I suppose we now know that there are processes in scholarship where it is perfectly legitimate and fine to use Wikipedia. There are certain contexts. There are certain contexts where it absolutely isn't. And I think exactly the same, we'll be saying the same about AI in another 25 years. And so trying to anticipate some of those things. I did actually ask ChatGTP if it walked under ladders in preparing for this talk. It told me it didn't, not because it was superstitious, but because it was dangerous. So there was just that as well. But I think this is a really key point that, you know, there is more to AI than machine learning, and I think that particularly came through in Stephen's presentation. So yes, I think sort of defining these different types of generative as opposed to creative content will be one of the key challenges, but I'll maybe hand over there.
Mm-hmm. No, but just, yes, I entirely agree. You know, I've used AI myself with notebook LM as well. I experimented with that because it's quite isolated, doesn't go on the internet. You just have a look at your sources and what you do. And clearly there's some massive potential there for, in terms of speed, as I said before, in terms of recognizing, patterns. Can you do more? Maybe you got doubts, but well, let's see, yes. Yeah.
I think if I understand your question correctly, going past AI or away from AI also, I think that I mentioned that I think that there is particular potential in art history and architectural history in spatial questions. I think there's been particularly productive work sort of after the so-called spatial turn in digital stuff and computational stuff. And I think that there's also, and this is obviously touches on my own work, which thankfully I'm not yet completely bored of. I think that the intersection of space and of vision, vision is obviously a sort of fundamentally cultured process. Like there is a biological process, but then how we interpret that is a fundamentally cultural process, and as such is of great interest to many art historians. And I think that some of the work that I've seen using super creative, using things like ArcGIS in super creative ways to model situated vision, to model embodied vision in historic context, to reconstruct spaces, and then think about, not necessarily in the way that I am, but also in other ways, to think about the experience of them and how they're perceived. That's something that computers can help us do in ways that that just, no amount of floor plan and me writing about it and thinking about it can quite do. And even visiting the site, much of what I work on and many others work on is no longer extant, is fundamentally changed. We can do sort of very, very elaborate and large data architectural reconstruction that is really fantastic, I think. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount of potential, and I feel like I'm leaving out people who do really interesting work on network analysis and other things that is not really my game.
Yeah. Here comes tonight.
Thank you very much. I think Microsoft released a list of top 40 professions that are most threatened by AI recently. Number 2 is historians. That raised my eyebrow slightly, and then I just Googled, and the AI response that actually it has a lot of limitations due to ethical and philosophical judgment, lack of it, lack of contextual understanding. So my take is that, if anything, historians will have to work more and harder to preserve the subject of the history. So what's your take on that?
Since I'm sitting here on mic and we're sort of seesawing back and forth, I have two concerns. One of the things is what I may have sort of running on the lack of sleep with some sick kids, sort of been too blunt in tonight, which is sort of saying that I think that historians play a really, really important role in critiquing the sort of popular biases that aren't necessarily founded in ill will, but just simply sort of exist in the zeitgeist. And that's that's a place where our work is I hope it remains relevant and is very important. The other thing, and I really, this struck me listening to Vincent speak, because you sort of picked apart what was problematic with the AI responses. But we all were trained as historians, I mean, without revealing our differing ages, certainly in a pre-AI world, and largely, almost in a pre-digital world. I remember very clearly my first email address as an undergraduate. And what particularly worries, and so we can say, okay, so there are these biases, not only but does that become harder as the historians who are being trained today the undergraduates being trained today come up through the high school students, secondary school students, come up in this environment? What I guess I'm saying is that check is there in part because you also were trained to do it without any of these tools. And I worry about the loss of that sort of grounding line that helps us see the types of biases that exist, often quite subtly. This wouldn't be a problem if there was a big red flag. It's that it's subtle. And yeah, that's, I guess, my concern.
Yes, so I guess it's the same kind of stuff. Since I teach African history, I know for a fact that most of the material I've used for my own research is not available online, or it's not digitized, it's behind a paywall, this kind of stuff I talked about. So, yes. So does it mean, that's a dilemma, does it mean it needs to be digitized so that AI is less Eurocentric? See the way it's kind of maybe false dilemma, but do you see the question here? And maybe the second thing I wanted to say is that I listened to a podcast by Jo Gouldy, who wrote this history manifesto years ago now, and she was in last year, well, it was the beginning of this year actually, and she argued that AI is not an independent researcher for the moment, cannot do two different archives, cannot do this kind of stuff. So basically, my job is not threatened yet, I suppose. That's the point. Yes.
I'd be interested to know what the most threatened profession is. Sorry?
Translator.
Translator. Yeah. Okay, right. I think that any kind of technological advance and innovation has always created angst of one sort or another. I am just about old enough to remember the prediction that the VCR recorder would end television and sort of the copyright and everything. The Y2K bug. I think there are always these kind of pushbacks in one way or another. And I think sort of what we're seeing from these presentations is we are kind of, as historians or whatever we are, sort of preemptively beginning to grapple with the content of some of those. So yes, I'll be interesting to see if that list gets updated in the future.
Yes. And so can we do... Sorry, yeah.
Thank you. What can we do to train the next generation of historians?
Well, actually, in my opinion, historians should be trained to do both, actually. That's what you said before, actually. I was first trained just with analog stuff. I was very interested in digital stuff myself. I was doing on my own, but my teachers couldn't teach me, really. It was impossible. Didn't have any email addresses, and what would my lecturers do, all of that, basically. There might be a generational effect here, but I think we should train them both, See, why couldn't we use the results of an AI prompt as a primary source itself? Why we can be critical in the same way as you were, we all were, actually, and yes, we can, of course, forget about all these courses about objectivity, about technology saving the world, all this kind of stuff which we had before, and that's just, to sell it, basically. That's all, kind of folklore as well around it already. Yes.
I guess I agree. As much as I wish we could turn back the clock 10 years in some ways and pause it, at least around things like this, I guess, that's obviously not going to happen. And so I feel that we have to engage in critical fashions. And I guess that particularly, I would say that we need to teach AI like any other, like scanning a text, right? It's a method. It has its limitations. It has its applications. It fits within a suite of methods. It complements this. It does that. The problem, I think, with both the popular imagination and with often the student use of AI is you say, my lecturer said I need to write a paper on the painter Wen Zhengming. Give me a paper. And it does it all from soup to nut. Okay, so that is problematic in all sorts of ways, not the least of which is intellectual dishonesty. But if I'm working in a large project and I say, I've got this particular thing, and it's this particular data source, and it would really help me if I could run all these archives through and see what it does. If I can use it in a constrained and complementary and critical fashion, so that then, just as I think we all talked about, the thing that comes out is then itself an object of critical analysis. What do I think of this? That's one of the things that I think is really exciting about the digital in art history. When I produce a digital model of something, I've not evacuated the object. I've not eliminated the object. I've not gotten rid of the art object. What I've done is given myself a surrogate of that object that I can then critically compare, like a slide comparison, to the original and ask questions of. And I think the products of AI, we need to teach the products of AI and other things in the same way. This is something that you now need to say, well, what is this thing I got? I've made something new, which hopefully we're starting to learn how to do. But I think it's, at least in my institute, it's still a sort of baby steps.
I think my quite brief homespun answer to that would be more programming skills at all levels of education offered by people like us and not by organizations with a vested interest in AI like Google. I think not ceding programmatic education to big tech is probably one of the most important things that we can do. And by that, I don't mean, training people how to use Python. I mean educating people in computational ways of thinking about the world, because that's ultimately what AI is, I guess, thinking with a small t. I'm not going to start revisiting the presentations, but yeah, that's probably where I'd start.
Can I begin with the question? I mean, I do a lot of historical work insofar as it deals with the past. I have grown used over the years, many years, to being told by students that the Brontes published under male names because they couldn't get published otherwise. When you look at the data from publishing records, it turns out that many more men felt they needed to use female pseudonyms to be published in the 19th century than females. I've never been told this by an undergraduate in an essay yet. Perhaps this will take some time to filter through. My question is really about bias. Do we want the unbiased truth? And if so, why? Is that a bias? Because most of nature does not want unbiased, neutral truth. Everything in nature is biased towards its own survival, but in all kinds of other ways. Somebody once told me that most molecules turn left rather than right. They spiral that way. But, symmetrical faces are prized because they're so rare. So what do we want from history? Do we want the truth?
But I guess that's the illusion that historians should write a form of objective type of narrative or argument in general. It's impossible to achieve. Obviously, I'm writing here. I'm based in a rich university in the UK, and yes, everything I write is somehow biased. I hope that me acknowledging my own biases and seeing biases of all the documents I use, including my own methods, including the AI, will make it more readable, I suppose, and my argument more intelligible to what audience and to my colleagues, I suppose. So I guess it's an illusion that AI is sold as a kind of absolute technology which will solve everything, like most technology are sold, in general. So that's why.
Gosh, not sure even where to begin with that, Steve. But I would guess that I suppose one thing that makes me laugh when politicians say we mustn't rewrite history, because that's literally what historians are paid to do. But they're not paid to write truth. They're paid to write about evidence and interpret evidence, and that is separate from truth. And I speak as someone who is administratively responsible for both the history and philosophy departments here. So I get both sides of it. So, I think, well, I mean, Vincent, you are in the history department. I mean, I would say that history is not about truth, it's about evidence, and that's not quite the same thing.
I think both of the answers are very good, and this is a very difficult question. But I am thinking of I won't now remember either the statistician who wrote this or the exact quote, but something along the lines of the measure of a model is not whether it's true, but whether it's useful. And I think that in many respects, history, I don't want to sort of overstretch that analogy, but history is in some sense a model. We have the evidence that we have. We sort of construct questions that are tailored to that, and we tell a story. I think your introduction was very good, that a great deal of what we're doing. I'm a great believer in Hayden White and the idea that what we're really doing is trying to tell stories that are coherent and meaningful to us, and that also in some way resonate with some interpretation, some recognizable interpretation of the past. To my mind, particularly I think as someone who I'm not alone in this, in any of us. I mean, the past is a foreign country, but I've chosen a career trying to understand the history of a culture that's not mine, is, at least by birth and descent, I do, whether or not I can aspire to a world in which there is no bias, that I don't think is possible, but I hope that my models are useful in the sense that they help resist bias. And that does not mean that I am not filled with bias and that my work isn't biased in some way. I hope it's biased in an arc towards justice or something, or no bias. But in any case, I think that we have to be aware of both in both directions in our work.
Yes. I was struck by this idea that the AI managed to read in 5 minutes what a professional historian took 3 to 4 days to read and understand. And I'm just curious, surely some kinds of research which would have been impossible just because they're too onerous are now possible. And I don't know if any of the panel sees any of those possibilities.
Yes, clearly. We have a colleague called Frédéric Mador who works on newspapers, digitized newspapers, and clearly we've got loads of them which have been digitized over the years. And he's basically created a massive database which was created by AI, basically, just instructed the AI to fill in, all the Excel spreadsheets basically at the basis of a database. And so yes, massive amounts of data, just read, deciphered and corrected, because there's an amount of correction which is needed at some point as well, and put into a database. Yes, so that's definitely possible now. It's going faster and faster. Yes,
I would definitely. Among other things, immediately, I would also immediately point to more scientific applications in art history and in conservation, technical art history, things like materials analysis. There is an answer that this material is cinnabar or vermilion or an artificial red, and the chemical analysis will tell us that. But we can now produce from a painting more data than we could make any real sense of ourselves, and I think that it's hugely useful in its interpretation. That's not to preclude other possible applications, but I definitely think that conservation science is doing great things with it.
I would just agree with what's said, and also I think it is important to also sort of capture that the sort of the volume of work that can be done can potentially lead to new questions, and sort of the framing and formation of questions is part of what research is all about. So I would just say yes as the answer to your question.
So, I use the online Oxford English Dictionary almost every day. It seems, this of course is not 21st century technology, this is 19th century technology, a body of knowledge collected by a whole load of people sending in slips of paper, providing examples of quotations of particular words. The fact that, however, that what took decades can now be made sense of and used to ask and answer certain kind of questions undoubtedly opens up new possibilities. But it doesn't answer the questions. There was a physicist in Cambridge I was having a conversation with called Chris Lester, and this was around the time, do you remember this, when the Large Hadron Collider was being turned on again, and people thought it's going to create a black hole, and that's the end of civilization. Well, it wasn't. But I said, Chris, what are you hoping for from this, from this new, massively expensive enterprise underneath Switzerland and France and CERN? And he said, I don't know, are you looking for the final piece of the unified classical system? And he said, no, I hope that we come up with something to argue about. And it seemed, isn't it true that we want to carry on? In other words, we might want to do what scientists call the grunt work more quickly, stuff that you could, lose a lifetime on, but not in order to settle the question, in order to get on with arguing, or at least doing different kinds of things with what we got. In other words, interpretation, which we presumably don't want to mechanize, or do we?
I feel like I've talked a lot. Go ahead. Well, I suppose if you're interested in digital humanities, there's been a whole debate about whether it's about tools, about research questions. I strongly believe, that's about research questions in general. So yeah, somehow it's just a tool, and that we're more interested in creating new questions. And so I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think, I think we would all agree that it's false to say that there is a sort of unified picture of the world that can be completed at any point. We'll risk being out of a job if that's the case, even without AI. But I would say I would maybe turn the question back slightly and say, does AI, in whatever form it comes, help us to argue more usefully? Mm-hmm. Whatever that means.
Just to follow on from the previous question, I'm not a computer scientist, so I'll preface this by saying maybe my premise is on shaky ground, but it's my understanding that LLMs are inherent in their architecture is hallucinations. And so I was wondering for Vincent if you would feel comfortable using Google's API to answer historical questions, that very basic, handwriting, deciphering and whatnot, or if that threshold of potential falsehoods means that it's ethically something that you wouldn't really want to engage with on a professional level.
Yes. I asked the LLM to put in between square brackets the words they kind of guessed. See, there's a probability, and when actually you submit a text, when the LLM guesses what's happening, you can ask, please, just let me check it myself. It tends to happen with names, with place names in particular, in foreign countries. Yeah, so in Cameroon, so imagine what happened. Actually, it was quite good, if I'm honest with you. So I corrected the text, to prevent any forms of hallucinations. You might remember that a few years ago, if you used OCR software, that it used to produce gibberish, right? If it wasn't done properly. The problem with AI actually is it doesn't. It just produces a word which is plausible, at least. So that's the problem. That's why it was a kind of countermeasure, if I want to call it that, a way of dealing with it, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, I would just, I guess, add that I find myself personally torn. The idea, I was joking when Stuart, or laughed when Stuart said that translators are, the most ardent job. But that's actually something that now all sorts of LLMs do pretty well, is translate both modern and actually colleagues of mine who work on early Chinese texts say that even classical Chinese, which is sort of notoriously hard and vague, can do remarkably good jobs. It will not only reasonably successfully translate out from classical Chinese, but if you hand it a modern Chinese translation of a previously classical Chinese text, it won't produce the original text necessarily, but there are models that will produce grammatically correct, plausible classical Chinese retranslations, so to speak. And this does go a little bit to the expertise issue. These colleagues can experiment with this because their Chinese is fantastic and they know what to test it against. You, in a sense, could see the bias quite easily because you knew the history already. You knew the documents. You'd done the work. But I also find myself sometimes torn because on the one hand, I don't read French terribly quickly, and I read French much better if I have an English translation next to it. I mean, as you might, but I can check it back against it. But I was preparing a conference paper, and I needed a translation of a French article. And so for literally the first time ever, I attempted to use ChatGPT or something to translate the article. Did a really bad job, which was a sort of lesson learned. I say that because there's a part of me that likes the fact that there are things that I can't do. And there are parts of me that like the limitations of what I can know and the sort of capacity to do things in a certain time. And I realize that probably just makes me old and somewhat of a Luddite. But part of it is that I also feel worried about giving up that piece of me that is human and is limited in its in my humanity as I think about these types of things.
This just triggered the second question. You mentioned you are related to the philosophy department as well. And the language of, I'm not a philosophy student, but from what I understand, philosophy of language talks about how language shapes our worldviews. So if we give away translation and subsequently, to some extent, language to AI, which is essentially a black box and we don't know how it operates, how it learns, and it's really hard to control its systems, there's probably an inherent risk to us more broadly. What do you think about that, if you have any thoughts?
Firstly, I must clarify that I am not actually a philosopher myself. This is, I put that front and center. But yes, I think that's absolutely right. And that is exactly the argument that Francis Young makes in that Substack post that I quoted in my presentation, that we have seen a kind of epistemological shift from the perception of AI-generated content, which, can be seen to plug definable holes in our knowledge about the world. And yes, it can be, and some people don't, he claims some people don't even attempt to make a distinction between the two. The idea that generated content has become ground truth in that sense. And yes, I would agree with both him and with the premise of your question that is a big risk. I don't have the answer to how one addresses it, but I think it is certainly one of the big issues with AI that we haven't yet cracked.
Maybe one thing I could add just quickly. I went to a training on neurodivergence last year. I was presented a website which uses LLMs to determine as to whether or not an email is aggressive, neutral, or too kind, basically. And actually, it's quite interesting because actually, I know that some individuals can't tell. And for a fact, I pressed the button, make it more aggressive, it worked. Make it kinder, it worked as well. And I must say, it was quite an interesting way of using AI, and that's from English to English, right? But still, was interesting usage of AI, I suppose. Yeah.
See, if anyone can make some money from this and give me a little bit, you're free to use it. But it seems to me that inevitably, I'm really interested by this slider bar for excitability and if you could imagine, maximally tunable AI, wouldn't you make a lot of money? Because then Stuart's notion, I'm a utilitarian, Stuart, so I agree that things that are useful, that's what matters, that they're useful. But it's undoubtedly useful to almost all humans to press their point of view home. And if you can get, machinery that will not be pretending to be even-handed, but precisely will maximize your bias and make it perfectly credible, you're going to make a lot of money, aren't you? So tunable AI, you heard it here first. Give up the idea of non-bias, and there's fortunes to be made. But it's a worry, surely. That's a step too far, I think, for a... Are there any more final thoughts? There is one I can see, and then I think we probably...
Thank you. I'd just like to ask a bit about your thoughts on the future of historical sources themselves. As I think about it, we spent millennia creating historical sources, then a few decades digitizing them, then they've got ingested into billions of parameters, and then we're in this new era where pretty much everything we create, for the most part from now on, will have some form of AI in it in some form or another. Just wondered, we've talked about the skills of future historians.
if there's particular skills involved in, sort of interpreting those new primary sources that might be a bit of a blend of human and AI.
I think I'd say we are still creating historical sources now, today, and sort of AI will be part of how we deal with them in the future, whether we like it or not. But I think your question sort of raises this really fundamental point about the relationship between the physical world and the digital world, which is incredibly intertwined and incredibly interconnected. It sometimes seems that it isn't, but I think, so what I've taken away from my colleagues' presentations is that those distinctions are far more subtle than they often seem. And I did have another thought, but it's completely tangential, sort of going off at a different direction. So I'm not going to go into that. I will just, just hand over.
I could answer the question in very different ways. I suppose I could start by saying that, say in the UK, only 5% of the National Archives have been digitized. So they never have enough manpower and money, taxpayers' money to do the all, basically. So basically it's a question about choice, what do we digitize? That's the first thing. The second thing is about the files themselves when they're digitally born. So maybe these ones will be preserved somewhere, but someone needs to choose to preserve them. So maybe the tweets from the government will be preserved by the National Archives. Maybe not my own social media. Maybe. But who's going to preserve them? And finally, something that all researchers face that we all have on our different hard drives, millions of files or thousands of files. What are we going to do with them? I don't know.
I think also I'm sort of caught in trying to think from the art historical perspective about, on the one hand, the idea that a lot of what I study or what my future colleagues will study will remain the product of individuals, and so individual archives, and so the scale in some respects will remain the same, and that's perhaps an okay thing. I think there's also real opportunity in the future. One of the things that would help correct the types of image database biases that we have is the opportunities for linking institutions together, of which there are already frameworks and efforts to try to do that, but that's a very political issue. And I wonder how we do some of that moving forward to change the nature of the data sources that we have. Finally, I guess I think that, a lot of what colleagues of mine in the future might study, it seems to me that the creation of the archive already involves, and perhaps this is always true of archives, what I'm about to say, and it won't sound as smart as I thought it did a second ago. It involves a great deal of interpretation in the creation of it. And I'm thinking in particular about like the types of documentation that architectural firms now create, which is very much thinking as they created about the archive that they're going to leave, about the record that they're going to leave, and how that will come. And that's probably always true. Now that I think about it, archives are always curated and culled, and why are there no documents from this period? Because the successor got rid of them and things like this. But I don't know. I mean, I think the sheer volume of data we're producing these days, which sometimes seems to me to be more than we need to remember. I don't know. Maybe we need to remember how to forget some too. I don't know.
I think remembering to forget might be an apt note. So we should thank our three speakers for a really stimulating evening, and thank yourselves too for some very probing and interesting questions. Look forward to the next Digital Futures look forward to seeing you there. Meantime, thank you very much indeed, and good night.